Today, I was genuinely shocked, and I found myself sitting in disbelief for a good minute. It's not easy to surprise me in chess. I've been playing for many years and seen countless games. However, what I witnessed was a sequence of moves that can only be described as God-level. I firmly believe that this is the way to play as white, as it unleashes a potent opening strategy. But wait, there's more. I've got an intriguing chess puzzle waiting for all of you. Be sure to stick around until the end to enjoy the complete experience. I'm referring to the Danish Gambit, where you kick off with pawn to e4, and from there, you boldly offer a couple of pawns to seize the initiative right from the start. It's a daring move, first one pawn, then the other, and when your opponent accepts, it sets the stage for an exhilarating game. You might underestimate the power of bishop to c4, where you boldly disregard pawns by allowing pawn takes on b2 and bishop takes on b2. Yes, it means sacrificing two pawns, but in return, you unleash two formidable bishops that dominate along their respective diagonals. This newfound spatial advantage gives you the freedom to maneuver. For example, you can easily bring your queen to b3 or d5, exerting pressure on critical diagonals and placing black in substantial trouble. I've personally had a lot of enjoyment and success with this opening, particularly in blitz chess. Let me share this insight with you so that you can put it to good use. First and foremost, it becomes apparent that black encounters difficulties in their development. Currently, your bishop exerts pressure, effectively tying down black's bishop to the defense of these pawns. Moving the bishop away isn't a straightforward option, because you could promptly capture the pawn on g7, leading to a catastrophic back-rank checkmate threat. If your opponent tries playing knight to f6 in response to the Danish Gambit, that move isn't going to be effective, as you can promptly challenge their setup with pawn to e5. This move not only regains the initiative, but also forces black to maintain a passive, undeveloped position. Additionally, your queen exerts control over key squares, thus restricting the movement of black's knight. The only remaining option, knight to e4, is susceptible to a highly common tactical sequence, one worth engraving in your memory. This tactic often leads to victories in Danish Gambit games, making it a crucial one to remember. The sequence kicks off with a daring bishop sacrifice on f7, a move you'll encounter frequently in various variations. Bishop takes f7, the king recaptures, and then comes the follow-up, queen to d5. This move serves a dual purpose, launching a double attack. Thanks to this potent combination, you not only regain your sacrificed material, but also accrue significant interest. However, it's crucial to remember that even though the black king may appear to be on a stable square, it has already moved. Consequently, it forfeits its right to castle, forever bound to remain on e8. Meanwhile, you can proceed with your development using the simplest moves available, biding your time to break open the position with e6 and ultimately delivering a decisive blow to the black king. This tactical sequence often leads to a winning position for white. In this position, you might wonder if there's any defense for black. While there might be some defensive options, in a real game of chess, it often appears to be a winning position for white. However, the most captivating variation unfolds right in the heart of the main line of the Danish Gambit. Here, your opponent recognizes the need to develop their pieces and achieve castling rights. Consequently, they opt for bishop to b4, delivering a check. In this scenario, I strongly recommend covering the check with the knight from d2, rather than c3, as you want to preserve the diagonal for your bishop, ensuring it remains active. Thus, you play knight to d2. Now, black's pawn on g7 is hanging, and black continues with knight to f6, aiming for kingside castling. Additionally, this knight attack indirectly targets your pinned knight. However, as we know, when your opponent advances their knight to f6, you have the option to kick it off with pawn to e5. This move not only initiates your attack, but also neutralizes black's knight threat. At this point, It might appear that black is exerting pressure on your pinned knight, but the game is far from over. Now, your opponent has placed a strong attack on your pinned knight. They believe they are in control and may even envision themselves castling kingside, reveling in their 2 extra pawns. In reality, if they were aware of the outcome awaiting them, they might consider resigning at this point. However, let's continue with their perspective. Here comes the move you've likely seen before: bishop takes f7. By now, this sacrifice shouldn't surprise you, as it's a common tactic that often leads to victory in various variations. The black king recaptures on f7, and you follow up with the cunning queen to b3. This move forces the black king to stand its ground while setting the stage for a double attack on both the king and the bishop. Your aim is to regain the bishop on the next move while exposing the king. At this juncture, black's optimal move is pawn to d5, an attempt to cover and solidify their position. Your opponent likely assumes that you'll proceed to capture the bishop, as that seemed to be the original intention of your queen's move. However, here comes the twist: instead of playing queen to b4, you unleash a brilliant in-between move: pawn takes d6. Remarkably, this move, known as an en passant capture, catches some players off guard, and it has even been reported as a bug on chess.com due to its unexpected nature. Indeed, the move is completely legal, and it brings an interesting twist to the game. This move functions as a discovered check to the black king. Facing this situation, black attempts to lock down the position, keeping it closed and safeguarding their king. Their move of choice is bishop to e6, which also has the added effect of attacking your queen. Consequently, you capture the bishop on b4. Now, the knight on e4 is left hanging, vulnerable to capture by your pieces. Black decides to exchange knights. At this point, your opponent is convinced that you will finally recapture their knight with queen takes d2. However, as has been the pattern, you surprise your opponent yet again. This time, you shift your queen to the king side by playing queen to f4, introducing another in-between move. With queen f4, you deliver a check, catching your opponent off guard once more. Your bishop continues to exert its influence over this diagonal, making it impossible for black to cover with the queen. Black proceeds with king to g8, maintaining the belief that they are in control of the situation, thinking that they'll eventually capture your knight, and all will be well. However, once again, you defy expectations. Instead of capturing black's knight, you play pawn takes c7. This move might seem unusual at first glance, but it sets up a rather unique fork on the queen and the knight, and it is supported by your queen from f4. This is precisely why you delivered that check on the previous move. Now, black is faced with a somewhat awkward position. They must safeguard both the knight and the queen, leading them to play queen to e8. This move serves a dual purpose. It guards the knight, while also potentially setting the stage for discovered attacks along the e-file. At this juncture, your opponent is 100% convinced that you will capture one of their knights, either the one on d2 or the one on b8. However, you once again defy expectations. These moves are not even at the level of a grandmaster like Magnus Carlsen, they are more like god-level moves. What you execute here is truly exceptional. You play queen to e5, creating a battery along this long diagonal, and threatening queen takes g7. This move puts enormous pressure on black's position. Typically, black's queen becomes rather careless about the rest of the army, which remains largely undeveloped. This may seem highly unusual, but it is the move that wins the game and is precisely what white should do. Now, while black can certainly defend this pawn, and they likely will, they are also forced to safeguard the bishop. This complicates black's position even further. Therefore, black plays queen to f7, attempting to address the immediate threat. However, in doing so, they relinquish the defense of their knight on b8. You seize this opportunity and capture the knight, promoting a new queen. This little pawn on c7 has certainly made quite a journey. It started on your e2 square, then advanced to e5, captured en passant on d6, moved to c7, and finally promoted on b8. This sequence illustrates what a real promotion looks like. It culminates in the creation of a new queen. With a check to the king, you've left black's position in disaster. They are compelled to make the trade. Queen takes check to the king. In a real live game, I would strongly recommend taking the queen and then capturing the knight on d2. This would leave your opponent's army in shambles, as you would be up a rook and a knight in an endgame, virtually guaranteeing victory. However, just to illustrate the intricate beauty of chess, I'll show you a line suggested by a computer. Playing queen to e5 at this point might be seen as a bit of extra trolling. You're threatening the bishop, yet you're still not taking anything, simply maintaining the pressure on your opponent. Now, at this point, your opponent will likely play queen to f7. Instead of capturing the knight for free, you opt for an exchange of knights. This exchange may worsen your pawn structure, but it's done with a clear objective in mind, opening up the g-file for your rook. The only way for your opponent to somehow provide one more defense to this pawn is by playing h6. After rook to g1, they make an awkward move, rook to h7. This move at least allows them to hold onto the pawn on g7. Now, you can finally castle, which is a standard opening move that brings your king to safety and connects your rooks. So, in this case, castling by white creates a checkmate threat with rook to d8, and black has no defense against it. This just goes to show how wild and surprising a chess game can be. I mentioned these as god-level moves, and I want to clarify that even top players like Magnus Carlsen might not find all of them in a real game. Interestingly, I've checked the chess databases, and this line is one of the most played by black, so you can indeed win games using the strategies I've shown you. Now, let's return to the opening because, overall, it's a great choice for you. Speaking of which, let's explore what else your opponent can play. We already understand that a problem for black is developing their knight, as you always respond with pawn to e5, kicking the knight away. So, some of your opponents might opt for d6 first to prevent your pawn from advancing, and then they'll think about developing. However, there's another issue with your knight, as sometimes you want to maneuver it to g5, potentially launching a menacing kingside attack. If your opponent notices this, they might attempt to challenge your bishop by playing bishop to e6. Here's a thought-provoking puzzle for you. What would be your move if your opponent plays bishop to g4? It doesn't lead to an immediate checkmate for black, but it does offer you an opportunity to gain a significant advantage. If you can find the solution, please share it in the comments below. Now, if your opponent responds to bishop to e6, attempting to neutralize your bishop, you can proceed with an exchange. After the exchange, follow up with queen to b3. This move creates a rather uncomfortable situation for your opponent because it simultaneously attacks the pawn on d7 and the one on e6. In most cases, your opponent will play queen to c8, desperately trying to defend both pawns. However, you can continue with knight to g5, which targets the pawn on e6 twice, with both the queen and the knight. In this situation, black finds themselves in a precarious position. The pawn can't move forward because then queen to f7 leads to a winning game, followed by knight to e6. However, this move doesn't work effectively for black. They often play the awkward move king to e7, but it becomes evident that with their underdeveloped pieces, and a centralized king, the only well-developed piece for black at this point, white has multiple ways to secure a significant advantage. One stylish continuation is knight takes e6. After queen takes e6, the pawn on b7 is no longer defended. White can capture it, simultaneously threatening to take the rook. Black's most significant issue isn't necessarily material, but their centralized king. If you can quickly complete your development and castle, black will find themselves in substantial trouble. You are on track for a winning position. In situations where you face an aggressive opponent who doesn't want to play passively, they might opt for a counterattack. They could make a move like queen to g5, targeting your pawn on g2. We are not shying away from the challenge. In fact, we are embracing it. Having already sacrificed 2 pawns, we are now prepared to sacrifice 1 more, all in the pursuit of a powerful attack. Knight to f6 is our move, inviting the opponent's queen to capture our pawn on g7, because this grants us an additional tempo to bring a rook into play. Now, the queen is under attack, and black's best move is queen to h3. Despite black amassing a couple of extra pawns, they find themselves in a completely passive position. Meanwhile, most of your pieces are actively placed on the board. This situation sets the stage for one of our standard tactics: bishop takes f7, leading to a promising position. Once again, the king can't simply capture the bishop on h6 because, in this case, the follow-up move isn't queen to d5. Instead, you play knight to g5, executing a royal fork on the king and queen, ultimately winning the queen on the next move. This isn't a viable option for black. Typically, black will play king to d8, attempting to find refuge behind their pawns. But this is where you break open the position. Rook takes g7 becomes possible, utilizing the power of your second bishop, which exerts influence along this diagonal. Additionally, you're now threatening the knight on g8. So, if they capture, you recapture with a bishop and simultaneously threaten to capture the rook on h8, gaining material. Interestingly, the most played move by black here is knight to h6, in which they hope to sacrifice the rook, but, at the very least, aim to win a bishop on f7. However, instead of accepting this trade, you simply retreat the bishop 1 square, delivering a neat checkmate. Up until now, we've discussed the most common moves that black might make. Let's now delve into some rarer lines that you might encounter from more advanced chess players who are well versed in opening theory and know the right way to navigate the Danish Gambit. So, how do we tackle these advanced players who know how to counter the Danish Gambit effectively? One of the more sound approaches for black in this situation is to kick off with knight to c6. This move might seem a bit counterintuitive, given that you're expecting them to go on the defensive and develop their kingside pieces for castling, which is what most players do. However, knight to c6 can be a stronger move because it prevents the bishop sacrifice we discussed earlier when black plays bishop to b4. So, if you play knight to d2, this move sets up for a different attack, as your usual tactical motif of bishop takes f7 followed by queen to b3 won't work here since the bishop on b4 is defended. So, with your knight on d2 and black castling, it might seem like black is in a good position with 2 extra pawns. However, we are going to employ a different strategy to create problems for black. Indeed, when you play knight to d5 in this situation, you apply substantial pressure to black's position. This move targets the knight on c6 and exerts pressure on the pawn on f7. What's more, your bishop also adds to the pressure from its position. This is precisely why we opt for this line when black positions the knight on c6. It creates a tense situation, and surprisingly, it puts black in a difficult spot. When they respond with knight to e7, your next move is queen to d4, forming a battery along this diagonal. This approach aligns with one of the principles of the Danish Gambit, which is to maintain a rapid attack before your opponent can complete their development, potentially securing an early victory. They could block this with d6, but then you have a discovery check with your bishop, allowing you to capture the knight on the following move. Alternatively, if they play knight to f5 in an attempt to attack your queen and defend the pawn, you can shift your queen to g4. This move keeps up the pressure on g7 and targets the knight on f5. Now, if your opponent ups for pawn to d6, attempting to defend their knight, you can play bishop to d3. This move unleashes a barrage of threats that can overwhelm your opponent. You're threatening the knight on c6, as well as the bishop on b4. The knight can't escape, because queen to h5 would result in checkmate. With threats abounding, black finds themselves in a difficult situation. For advanced opponents, they might choose the classical move of pawn to d5, as it is often recommended in chess books, as a way to counter the Danish Gambit. The idea behind black's move is to give up one of their extra pawns to facilitate development and potentially initiate piece exchanges. However, when they follow up with bishop takes d5, some players may be tempted to play pawn to c6, with the intention of trading queens and freeing their bishop. This move, though, is a critical mistake for black. If they play c6, you can win with bishop takes f7, as you've seen in previous variations. The key is that if the king moves, you capture the queen on d8 with a check, and black's king is forced to move again. If your opponent attempts to preserve their queen by advancing their king to e7, you can initiate an attack on the king using your bishop with the move bishop to a3. The king will have limited mobility, and its only recourse is to capture the bishop on f7. Subsequently, on the following move, you can capture black's queen. Now, let's examine what happens if black ups for knight to f6. This is a classical response suggested by chess books to equalize the game for black. However, it doesn't necessarily give black an advantage, it just helps them equalize the position. In this situation, a recommended move for white is to play knight to c3, defending the bishop on d5. While black can trade off by capturing the bishop, you still maintain a strong position with your knight on d5, and you continue to put pressure on black's position. Despite the equalization attempt, it's not easy for black to play this position, and white still has active piece play. Often, black might play a move like c6, which can be a blunder in some cases, giving white an opportunity for a strong attack. However, the game can take various directions from here, and it's crucial for both players to continue developing their pieces and creating threats. So, even if your opponent chooses this approach to equalize, it doesn't necessarily mean that white is at a disadvantage, and the game can still be played with rich tactical possibilities. When you play the Danish Gambit, you make a bold move by sacrificing your knight on f6 to check the opponent's king. This sacrifice is supported by your bishop, which means your opponent has to capture your knight with a pawn. As a result of this exchange, you both trade queens on d8. This combination of moves leads to you gaining a material advantage. On the following move, you can capture a pawn, and then in the next move, you have the opportunity to capture your opponent's rook, further increasing your advantage. Now, can your opponent avoid facing the Danish Gambit? Certainly, they have the option to resign before the game even begins. However, if they decide to play on, they'll have to deal with the threat of your pawn taking on e5 after d4. If they respond with knight to c6, you can simply play d5 to chase their knight away. If they capture on d4, you offer another pawn, and it's likely that they'll have to accept it. If they don't, you'll capture on d4 on your next move. In case your opponent tries to challenge your center with d5, after the exchange of pawns, you can continue by developing your knights and proceed with a more typical game of chess. What other options do they have? Well, if they decide to capture your pawn on c3, you can respond by playing bishop to c4, inviting them to capture your pawn on b2. However, if they choose not to attack on c3 and opt for moves like knight to c6 while you develop your own knight, which will lead to a similar position as the Danish Gambit. In some cases, you can also choose to develop your knight while recapturing the pawn on c3. This particular line of play is known as the Goring Gambit, which has similarities with the Danish Gambit, but follows a slightly different opening sequence. If you're interested in learning more about the Goring Gambit, there are dedicated resources and videos available to explore this opening in greater detail. Now, it's time for a puzzle. In the given position, it's white's turn, and you need to find the best move for white. Share your answers in the comments, and let's see how many of you can solve it correctly. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated with future videos. Take a moment to check out the other videos appearing on your screen right now. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Take care and peace.